The Third Testament, Revelations of Jesus Christ, Chapter 9, Stories and Personages of the People of Israel. The story of original sin. Thus saith the Lord. The story of the first man that inhabited earth was passed from generation to generation until it was written down in the book of the first era. It is a living parable about those first beings that populated the earth. Their purity and innocence permitted them to feel the caress of Mother Nature. A warmth of friendship existed between all beings, and complete brotherhood between all creatures. In a divine parable, I inspired the first men to begin to have knowledge of their destiny, but the meaning of my revelations was poorly interpreted. When you were told of the tree of life, of the knowledge of good and evil, of which man ate, I only wish to make you understand that when man comes to have sufficient knowledge to distinguish between the just and unjust, and began to be responsible for his acts, from that time he began to gather the fruits of his works. You know that God said to men, "Grow, multiply, and replenish the earth." That was the initial law that you were given, O people. Later, the Father would not ask men only to multiply, and that the species continue to grow, but rather that their sentiments are ever more elevated, and that their spirits begin a broad development and unfolding. Moreover, if the first law were that of the propagation of the human race, how can you conceive of the Father applying sanctions for obeying and fulfilling his mandate? People, is it possible that such a contradiction could exist in your God? Look at what material interpretation men gave to a parable that spoke only of the awakening of the Spirit in man. Therefore, analyze my teaching, and do not say anymore that you are paying the debt the first inhabitants acquired for disobedience to your Father. Have a more elevated idea of divine justice. This is the time in which you can understand me when I tell you, grow and multiply and replenish the universe with your good works and elevated thoughts. I welcome all who wish to come to me, to all who seek perfection. Free will and original sin. You say to me that because of the freedom of will, you have fallen into faults and errors. I also say that through that gift, you can infinitely elevate yourselves beyond the point from which you departed in the beginning of your elevation. In addition to the freedom of will, I endowed each spirit with my light in its conscience, so that no one would be lost. But those who did not want to hear my voice, or did not want to penetrate into their innermost in search of the spiritual light, were quickly tempted by the countless beauties of the human existence. They lost the support of my law for their spirit, and they had to stumble and fall. Just one fault brought many painful consequences, and the fact is that imperfection does not harmonize with the divine love. Those who yielded and repented returned immediately to the Father, and humbly asked him to cleanse and liberate them from their sins committed. The Father received with infinite love and charity. He comforted their spirit. He sent them to correct their faults and strengthened them in their mission. Do not think that everyone returned meek and repentant after the first disobedience. No, many arrived filled with arrogance or hate. Others with shame, realizing their guilt, tried to justify their faults before me, and far from purifying themselves through repentance and atonement, which is proof of humility, they choose to create for themselves a life of their own choosing, outside of the laws which my love dictates. Then my justice manifested itself, not to punish, but to correct them, not to destroy, but to preserve them eternally, providing them with an ample opportunity to perfect themselves. How many of those first sinners still have not rid themselves of their blemishes, because fall after fall they kept descending more and more into the depths of an abyss, from which only the practice of my law can save them. The Flood. In the earliest times of humanity, there was innocence and simplicity in men, but as they multiplied, due to their evolution and their free will, their sins also continued to grow, and rather than their virtues, it was their faulty before my law that developed faster. It was then that I prepared Noah by communicating with him from spirit to spirit, because I established this type of communication with mankind when man first came to dwell on earth. I said to Noah, I will send a great flood to earth to purify the spirit of man of all his sins. Build an ark and tell your children, their wives, and your grandchildren to go inside the ark. Also, place a pair of animals from each species on earth inside the ark. Noah was obedient to my command, and the cataclysm arrived in fulfillment of my word. The bad seed was pulled up by its roots, and the good seed conserved in my granaries, with which I formed a new humanity that bore within it the light of my justice, and knew how to comply with my law and live practicing good customs. Perhaps do you believe that those individuals who suffered painful deaths perished both physically and spiritually? Truly, I tell you, my children, they did not. Those spirits were saved by me, and they awoke before the judge of their own conscience. They then were prepared to return once again to the path of life in order to progress spiritually. The unselfishness of Abraham. It will not always be necessary for you to drain the cup of bitterness. It will be enough for me to see your faith, your obedience, your purpose and intentions to obey my commandments, for me to free you from the most difficult moments of your trials. Remember that Abraham was asked for the life of his son, Isaac, who he loved much, and that the patriarch, overcoming his pain and the love he felt for his child, prepared himself to sacrifice him as a proof of obedience, faith, love, and humility that you cannot yet understand. But he was not permitted to consummate the sacrifice of his son, because already in the depths of his heart he had proven his obedience to the divine will, and that was enough. Oh, how great was the rejoicing of Abraham when his hand was held back by a greater force, preventing him from sacrificing Isaac. Oh, how he blessed the name of his Lord and marveled at his wisdom. In Abraham and his son Isaac, I gave you an image of what would be the sacrifice of the Redeemer, when he put the love that Abraham professed for me to the test, asking of him that he sacrifice his son, his beloved Isaac, by his own hand. In that act, if you know how to meditate upon it, you will find a similarity to what later was the sacrifice of my only son for the salvation of the world. Abraham was the representation of God, and Isaac the image of Jesus. At that moment, the patriarch thought that if the Lord asked him for the life of his son, it was so that the blood of the innocent might wash away the failings of the people, and despite loving deeply he who was the flesh of his flesh, obedience to God, and charity and love for his people were stronger in him than the life of his beloved son. The obedient Abraham was about to unleash the mortal blow at his son, but at the moment when, racked with anguish, he raised his arm to sacrifice him, my power stopped him, ordering him to sacrifice a lamb in place of his son, so that this symbol would remain as a testimony to love and obedience. The ladder to heaven in Jacob's dream. Do you know what meaning is contained in the ladder that Jacob beheld in his dreams? The ladder represents the life and evolution of the spirits. The body of Jacob slept at the moment of revelation, but his spirit was awake. He had ascended towards the Father, seeking prayer as the means, and upon entering it, the regions of light, he came to receive a celestial message that would remain as a testament of revelations and spiritual truths for his people, which is all humanity, for Israel is not a material, but a spiritual name. Jacob saw the ladder with its base on earth and its top touching the sky. This shows that the road of spiritual elevation that begins on earth through the flesh and ends up uniting its light and essence with that of the Father, apart from all material influence. The patriarchs saw that by the ladder angels ascended and descended, representing the incessant incarnation and disincarnation, the continuous coming and going of the spirits in search of light, or also on their mission of restoration and purification of themselves, to elevate themselves a little more upon returning to the spiritual world. It is the road of spiritual evolution that leads to perfection. And that is why Jacob beheld the representative form of Jehovah at the top of the ladder, indicating that God is the goal of your perfection, of your aspirations, and the supreme prize of infinite joy as the compensation for arduous struggle, prolonged suffering, and perseverance in reaching the bosom of the Father. Amongst the vicissitudes and trials, the Spirit has always found the opportunity to earn merit from the ascent. There, in each trial, the ladder of Jacob has been represented, inviting you to climb one more step. A great revelation, O disciples, was that, for in it the spiritual life was spoken of at a time when the awakening of the Spirit to the worship of the divine, the elevated, the pure, the good and true had barely begun. That message could not have been for one single family, or even for one single people. Its essence was spiritual, and therefore was universal. For that very reason, the voice of the Father said to Jacob, "I am the Lord, God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou lie, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Joseph and his brothers. Joseph, son of Jacob, had been sold by his own brothers to some merchants who were traveling to Egypt. Joseph was still young, but had already given evidence of a great gift for prophecy. Envy took charge of his brothers, who got rid of him, believing that they would never see him again. But the Lord, who watched over his servant, protected him and made him important to the Pharaoh of Egypt. Many years later, when the world was stricken by drought and hunger, Egypt, guided by the counsel and inspirations of Joseph, had stored enough provisions to withstand the trial. It was then that the sons of Jacob arrived in Egypt to search for food. Great was their consternation when they recognized that their brother, Joseph, had become minister and counselor to the Pharaoh. Upon seeing him, they fell from their feet to their knees, repenting of their transgression, and recognized that the prophecies of their brother had been realized. He who had been given up for dead was there before them, full of power, virtue, and wisdom. The prophet whom they had sold was showing them the truth of the prophecy that the Lord had placed on his lips as a child. The brother they had humiliated, selling him, was pardoning them. Do you understand, people? Now you know why I have said to you this day. When will you recognize me as Joseph was recognized by his brothers? The people of Israel's pilgrimage with Moses through the desert. In the first era, Moses was at the head of Israel in guiding them through the desert for 40 years to the land of Canaan. But from disobedience, lack of belief, and materialism, some blasphemed, others reneged, and yet others rose in rebellion. Moses, confronted with such a situation, told them with prudence and patience not to offend the supreme will, but to be humble and obedient before that Father who, without considering their disobedience, had made manna fall from the sky and water spring forth from the rocks. Moses had offered sufficient proof that the true God was with him, but the people wanted more evidence. The messenger, taking the multitudes to the slopes of Mount Sinai, called upon the power of Jehovah, and the Lord, hearing him, granted him great proofs and miraculous things. The people wanted to hear and to see the one to whom Moses listened and the one whom he perceived through his faith. I manifested myself to those people in a cloud and had them listen to my voice for hours and hours. But it was so potent that men felt themselves dying of fear. Their bodies shook and their spirits trembled before that voice of justice. Then the people begged Moses to plead to Jehovah not to speak any longer to his people, for they could no longer listen to him. They recognized that they were still too small to communicate directly with the Eternal One. Forge your spirit in the great combats of life, just as did that people of Israel in the desert. Do you know how great is the desert, with which its harsh sun and burning sands appears to have no end? Do you know what loneliness and silence are, and having to maintain vigilance because enemies watch? Truly, I tell you, it was there in the desert that the people knew the greatness it was to believe in God, and learn to love Him. What could that people hope for from the desert? Nonetheless, they had all: bread, water, a home in which to rest, and an oasis and sanctuary wherein to elevate their grateful spirits toward the Father and Creator. The struggle of Elijah for the true God. In the first era, Elijah came to earth and found that humanity was practicing idolatry and did not believe in God. The world was being governed by kings and priests, and both had departed from the obedience to divine laws and were guiding their people along paths of confusion and falsehood. They had erected altars to different gods which they worshipped. Elijah appeared in that time and spoke to them with words of justice, telling mankind, "Open your eyes and see that you have disrespected the law of the Lord. You have forgotten the example of his messengers and have fallen into a worship which is unworthy of the living and powerful God. It is necessary that you awaken, that you see and recognize him. Eliminate your idolatry and lift your eyes above every figure with which you have represented him." Elijah heard my voice, which said to him, "Depart from the wicked people of that nation. Tell them that rain will not fall for a long time, not until you order it so in my name." And Elijah said, "It will not rain until my Lord appoints the hour and my voice orders it." And thus saying, he departed. From that day forth the land was dry. Many normally rainy seasons passed without rain. There were no signs of water in the sky. The fields felt the drought. The cattle began to perish. Men unsuccessfully dug into the earth looking for water to quench their thirst. Rivers dried up. Overcome by the rays of the red-hot sun, the grass withered. And men cried out to their gods, asking for rain to return to them in order to sow and harvest the seed which fed them. Elijah had departed by divine mandate. He prayed and awaited the will of his Lord. Men and women began to leave their lands in search of new places which did not lack water. Wherever one looked, there were caravans, and all the land was dry. Years went by, and one day when Elijah elevated his spirit to the Father, he heard his voice saying, "Seek out the king, and when I give you the sign, the waters once again will fall over the land." Filled with obedience, Elijah humbly went before the king of that nation and showed his power before the worshippers of the false gods. After that, he spoke about the Father and of his power. Then the signs appeared: lightning, thunder, and fire were seen in the sky, followed by an abundance of rain. Once again the fields became green, and the trees were filled with fruit, and there was abundance of many things on earth. Faced with this proof, the people awakened and remembered their father who called and warned them through Elijah. The 12 tribes of Israel. Do not believe that prophets, forerunners, and spirits of light have existed only in the bosom of the people of Israel. To other peoples also I have sent some of these, but men took them as gods, not as envoys, and under their teachings created religions and cults. The people of Israel did not understand the mission they had with the other peoples, and slept in a bed of blessings and complacency. The Father had formed them as a perfect family, in which one tribe had the mission of defending the other people and maintaining peace. Another worked the earth, and another were fishermen and navigators. To yet another was entrusted spiritual worship, and so on. Each one of the 12 tribes that made up the people carried out a different mission that together served as an example of harmony. And truly, I say to you, the spiritual gifts that you possessed in those first times, you have still. The prophets and first kings of Israel. The prophets spoke with great truth. They came to earth almost always in times of great confusion and strain, admonishing the peoples, inviting them to repentance and to make amends, proclaiming great trials of justice if they did not turn back to the good, and other times predicting blessings for observation and obedience to the divine law. But what those prophets spoke of was an exhortation toward the practicing of good, justice, and respect for one another. They did not come revealing the life of the Spirit, its destiny and evolution. Not even Moses himself, who I chose to be made my representative, and through whose channel I gave the law for all time, spoke of the spiritual life. The law of the Father encompasses wisdom and justice, teaches men to live in peace, to love and respect one another, and make yourselves worthy before me, as men. But Moses did not show humanity that which is beyond the threshold of bodily death, nor what the restitution of the disobedient spirits is, or the price for those that are prudent and jealous of their mission. Later, David reigned, full of gifts and inspiration, and in his moments of elevation, in his ecstasy, he heard the hymns and spiritual songs with which he formed the psalms to invite the people of Israel to pray and give the best offerings of their hearts in tribute to the Lord. Yet David, with all his love and inspiration, could not reveal to the people the marvelous existence of the spirits, nor their evolution or their goals. And again Solomon, who succeeded him in his reign, and who also showed the great gifts of wisdom and power that had been given to him, and for which he was loved and admired, and whose counsel, judgments, and proverbs are all remembered today. If his people had approached him to ask, "How is the spiritual life? What is beyond death? What is the spirit?" Solomon, with all his wisdom, could not have answered.